Hi, we're going to talk about inflation. Inflation is a very prominent and evident problem in the Philippine market. Inflation means that it's a general increase in prices of certain goods such as food prices, utility rates, transportation, and oil prices.
So in this graph, we can see that this is a law and supply and demand graph. So we can see that this is the quantity and this is the price. This is the demand curve and this is the supply curve. But here, we're not gonna talk about the determinants as we usually do. Here, we're gonna talk about supply and demand separately and individually. So for the demand curve or the demand line, for example, inflation happens right after, usually right after a tragedy. Like for example, right now in August 6, our inflation rose up a lot rapidly. So all of the overprices right now, especially garlic, rice, is pretty high recently right now because of the recent typhoon Glenda. So right after tragedies and natural disasters, usually there's an inflation in overall prices. So for example, if tragedies and natural disasters happen in the Philippines, many of their products are affected. For example, let's take rice. Our rice fields are destroyed, so that puts our supply down. So it's down. But during the natural disaster, we want more rice because we're in a time of need, right? So demand goes up. And once it goes up and supply goes down, we can see the line here. And what do you call that? Shortage. There is a shortage in supply and in the market right now because demand is higher than the supply. So the supply does not satisfy the demand. The only way to solve or satisfy the demand, what happens is that prices goes up. So what happens if prices go up? That is to achieve market equilibrium. So if prices go up, demand goes down, like in the demand of supply, and supply goes up because there are less people to buy because of the lower quantity of demand, and that is to achieve market equilibrium, which is in the middle. So if prices go up, demand goes down, supply goes up. No more shortage, equilibrium. And that is how inflation works and usually happens right after the natural disaster. And that concludes how inflation in the economic point of view.
Information to the effects of micro and macro. First, I'll be discussing micro. Micro basically is the small companies, small firms, small businesses, and family households around the Philippines. So first, what happens what happens to these micro companies when inflation is implemented? First, the raw materials will increase. So once the raw material increases, the companies will have no choice but to increase their selling prices as well. Once they increase their selling prices, the consumer demand will lessen unless it's a necessity. Take this ukulele for example. If the raw material to make a ukulele increases, the ukulele company will have no choice but to buy it in a more expensive price and to sell it in a more expensive price also. When this happens, less people would actually want to buy a ukulele because it's not really a necessity. Also, another point with this is that most people will have less money to spend on the other necessities. The next point that I will discuss is the macro. The macro is really similar to the micro. It's just that it's in a more prominent and larger scale in the country, and the effects are more prominent in the country. So first, macro, or the large companies in the Philippines or the government. So the large companies will need to spend more on their materials. So once they spend more on their materials, they'll obviously need to sell it at a higher price. So once they sell it at a higher price, it will lower the consumer demand. So what happens? Why will the consumer demand lessen? It's because first, either they will save their money since the living rate in the country will be more expensive, or second, they would spend it on necessities only. So companies that aren't a really necessity like the ukulele won't actually make as much money and will actually make the economy move slower since the money movement will lessen since, as I said a while ago, the people may either save their money or only spend it on their necessities. The next point that I'll be discussing are the pros and cons. First, how will inflation actually benefit the country? Is that if the inflation isn't too high, this means that the people can still spend that extra money on the things they need and still live properly. Also, this can actually be a risky thing to do because if the inflation actually goes too high, there could be a lot of disadvantage that it may give to the country. One disadvantage is that the living rate in the country will be much more expensive. Second, the people may actually ask for a raise and chaos might break out. How will chaos break out? First is because if the people ask for a raise, they may actually start in revolt against the government since inflation is too expensive to live in the country. And the last thing, I think, which is the most important, is that the general mass in the Philippines will have a harder time in living since each necessity becomes more expensive and they'll have to spend more on their necessities alone in order to survive in the country.
So, as previously stated by my partners, it can be clearly seen that inflation is a huge problem in our society and that it could cause many different things to the people, the government, and the company. So, we have different solutions for inflation. We have thought of 3 different solutions, and the first one is to think of substitutes for the certain product. The second one is to increase interest rate, and the third is to import products to increase the supply of the product. So our first solution is to have substitutes. By having substitutes for a certain supply or a certain product, you will be able to reduce the demand of the people for that certain product. Because if people will have a substitute, people wouldn't go after that certain product because they'd have something else. And by reducing this demand, people wouldn't want to use their money and spend it on that certain product. So that means the government or the supplier would able to increase the supply, and this would cause inflation to degrade. An example of this is, for example, boots. Boots is a necessity for people because it's something that we need in daily living. An example of having a substitute for this are having sneakers instead of boots. By using sneakers, we can be able to have a different way of living. By using sneakers, people would demand sneakers more and boots less. So the supply of boots would increase, and then the supply of sneakers would decrease since it's not having that problem of inflation. The problem of inflation is because the prices of a certain product increase really high, and people tend to demand it, but then they don't have enough money. So if you give a substitute, people would go for that one instead. Our second solution is to increase interest rate. By increasing interest rate, people would want to borrow money less from the government or banks. And if people borrow less money from governments or banks, they would have to save their money more. And because of this, people wouldn't want to keep spending and spending, because since they have to save their money, they have to keep it within themselves. They have to use this money for the necessities. Because if people wouldn't want to borrow money from the banks or governments, then they'd want to save it instead. And if they save this, that would reduce the demand for the products that are being inflated. And then people would use this money instead to buy the things that are necessary for their living. An example of these necessities are food or other products that will keep us alive. The last solution that we have is to have imported products. The imported products would be the same product as the product being inflated, but then we'll be importing it from other countries because by doing this, there will be a higher supply in that product. Like for example, the boots. If the boots are being low in supply, we can import boots from other countries, and by importing this, we will have a higher supply, and this higher in supply would meet the demands of the people. And then by doing that, it would solve the high demand, and it would solve the inflation because the high prices wouldn't be too much of a problem anymore. Even though this would help solve inflation, it wouldn't fully solve it because inflation is something that doesn't just go away. Inflation is something that we can only stabilize because inflation is an increase in prices, and the only way we can help in that increase in prices and the demand of the people is by increasing the supply.
This is a very big problem in the economy, simply because everyone is affected by this economic issue. This economic issue is being opposed because the prices of all necessities are increasing. Just as you said, everyone is greatly affected by this economic issue, from the smallest units of our country, to family households, and even to the government itself. Everyone is a stakeholder to inflation.
I hope the government is aware of this and provides enough service and tries to stabilize it as much as possible, because that's their job. The government, you can never solve inflation, but the government should stabilize it. A good stable inflation is good for the country, but a rapid increase in overall prices is bad. It's just natural to happen, but even though it's still natural, it's still one of the biggest problem for our market right now here in the Philippines, and it is currently happening right now according to the Philippine Star, and there are a lot of articles in the business section about it. Transportation, utility rate, food prices, oil prices are right now really expensive because of the recent Typhoon Glenda. A lot of the sources will be posted in the credits after, so if you want to check it out, you can check it out. And basically that's inflation. I hope you understand, and I hope that you enjoy the crash course we made about inflation. I hope it gave you the right amount of information to help you with your tests, to understand more about our economy and raise awareness about what's happening in the world right now. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the video. This is Stacy looking at his foot. This is
Prices of certain goods such as food prices, utility rates, transportation.
Oil! This for now! Food! Utility! Oil! Information to the effects of micro and macro. First, I'll be discussing micro. Micro basically is this.